Thank you very much, Maria. And I would like to join others in echoing my gratitude to Garrison for putting on this program. And in particular, I'd like just to add, which hasn't been mentioned, but I'd like to make notice of the staff who's worked behind the scenes, who's just done an incredible job. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the science panel on how the brain works, because prior to this, from my personal experience, the only thing I knew about the brain is the brain began to work the day you were born and never stopped until you stood up to speak in public. So I was asked to address the question of how can one be a more effective advocate in promoting what I have up here as CTL, which is intended to mean contemplative teaching and learning, which is something that was invented by Linda. So I just want to make note of that. And what I would like to do is to start by talking a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. And I want to talk about how one can persuade people in positions of authority, administrative leaders, they could be principals, superintendents, they could be people in other positions. How do you persuade them about the value of this work? And I come at it as knowing a little bit about leadership, but not an expert on contemplative practices in the school. And I also come from it from the perspective that I think is really important if this is going to move forward, that in advocating programs, that we advocate programs that are evidence-based, the kinds of programs that you're going to see in the marketplace of ideas later in the afternoon. I don't think it's foreordained that the movement, as it spreads, is going to necessarily be a good one. I think that there's a lot of forces at play to say, gee, this is a great idea. All of a sudden, mindfulness is catching on. Maybe we ought to do some of it. Let's just put some things in the school. I think people like those in here who are really concerned about making sure that they're working on programs that have evidence that they have some positive outcomes can make a big difference. How to do it? My argument I'm going to make is that you have to engage both the heads and the hearts of administrators. Now, some of you probably thought that administrators you encountered didn't have any hearts, but in fact they do. And the argument I want to make is you really got to do, one of the things you have to do is you got to put yourself in the shoes of the people in these positions. And what I'd like to talk a bit about is how do leaders, at more of a general level, think about spending money, and how do leaders often feel on the job? And I think you need to take both of that into account. On the latter point, the argument I'm going to make is if you look at both the external and the internal life of leaders, there's tremendous stress and strain that I think that you, as many of you as teachers, recognize, but may not fully recognize the way it gets played out with the people that you're trying to perhaps get money from. And the advice is advice on how you can be a more effective advocate. Okay, what I want to talk about is, and I'm going to introduce you to, I'm a big believer in acronyms, and I'm a big believer in acronyms. This is one of 3 acronyms I'm going to introduce you to. I'm a big believer in acronyms because you need, I think, tools to kind of remember things. Now, I love acronyms, but I know a lot of other people it drives crazy. But here's the first. I think that in ahead of a lot of administrators, both in universities and in schools and district order offices, is this acronym SPEND. That when they're being approached by somebody with a new program, teachers with a new set of ideas, they think about these things implicitly. I know from my experience, I thought about them explicitly as a checklist in my mind when thinking about whether or not to support of activity. And I know principals and superintendents who also think about it explicitly. One is to think about S, which stands for what's the symbolism of what is being proposed? What is the precedent? Is there a precedent that may be involved? E stands for equity, issues having to do with fairness, and N stands for need, and D for dollars. And I find it very helpful. One of my experience is that what advocates often do is they focus on a narrow definition of need, and they focus on dollars, but often don't address the kind of questions that are raised that an administrator may look at. And the symbolism is, if I'm going to get involved in supporting this new program, what's the symbolism to the broader community? Is this going to send a message that I'm in the forefront of new activities? Or is this going to send us the message that it's another flaky, soft idea while we're really trying to deal with hard things? And if you're going to be persuasive, you need to think about those things and come up with an argument. The precedent issue is that often you can have a wonderful idea that administrators aren't going to buy into, because if they support that, it'll establish a precedent within the organization, which means that they have to support other things that they may not necessarily want to support. So you need to be thinking about, is there a precedent? Or make the argument that this is not a precedent-setting activity, therefore that is not something they need to worry about. And E stands for equity. There are a lot of I've seen situations where people would want to support something, they think it's a great idea, but there's a limited amount of resources and there's a strong norm of fairness within the organization. So they may not do it because not enough money to go to other things. My argument here is basically you got to think about spend, and not just the N and the E, but the S, the P, and the E. You also, in my experience, you need to think about need perhaps in a broader way than a lot of people think about it. Often people think about need in terms of research. If we can show them the research that this is really important, if we can show evaluative results that this program is a great idea, that that's going to sell it. My experience is that often we overestimate the relationship between good research and decision making. Research obviously is really important, and Mark made a terrific case last night of the need to do it right now, and I wouldn't in any way dispute that. But often in administrative situations, research is a nice thing to have, but it often is not the thing that determines whether things move forward. So it's not just research, I think, but also stories. Stories are powerful mechanisms for getting points across, and we just saw some examples of that with Linda. I mean, you notice Linda's talking along, and all of a sudden she wants to tell you a story. And there's a way in which when people say that, and it's a good story as Linda told, people stop dead. And it's a way often of capturing what's really important. So in making your argument, the importance of stories. I argue not just local need, but competitors. The point I'm making here is that often in making a case for a particular program in a particular school or system, they talk about the need here, while from the perspective of an administrator, they're thinking about the need there, but they're also thinking about their peer group. How is that going to show up with relationship to the people I worry about? Is this going to put me in the vanguard of what's going on? Or you make the argument that other people in the peer group are already doing and you don't want to be left behind? And not just arguments, but allies. The point here is the obvious one, that arguments matter, research matters, stories matter, but this is often making decisions as a political decision. Political in the best sense of the word, of having a coalition of people who really think it's important. So if you're going to be successful, who in the system are the kind of the people of influence who you might get behind your effort to get a program funded? And then not just words, but experiences. It's really important sometimes with people not just to have them get the argument from hearing you say it, but if you have the opportunity, bring them into the program. Have them sit down with the kids that may be involved in some type of mindfulness practice. Have them sit on the floor with them. And somehow you can often see that it can be very influential in getting people to believe in the kind of things that you're talking about. Last point is don't oversell. I mean, we could argue that yes, there's a kind of a way indirect relationship between some of this work and improvement of academic activities and test scores, but the temptation might be to say, okay, we're going to do this, and the need for it is because of really raised test scores. I think that's a real stretch. It goes way beyond what we really know, and the overpromising of that kind of thing may help you in the very short run, but I think is very harmful in the long run. Okay, now I want to switch gears to my from thinking about how leaders think or administrators think, but to how they feel. And get to my second acronym. I think it's fair to say that administrators live in what's sometimes called a VUCA world. Now, what does VUCA stand for? It stands for a volatile, uncertain, complex, chaotic, and ambiguous. Now I love acronyms, but the Army, I can't compare with the Army. This comes from the US Army, and it's an expression of the world that they live in. But I would argue that this is the world that a lot of administrators and a lot of you live in. The things are volatile, uncertain, complex, chaotic, and ambiguous. The argument beyond that I would make is that the job of being an administrator has always not been an easy job, but it's gotten a lot harder. And what I have here as a quote is from a email that I got from a high school principal just the other day when we were discussing some matters, and I'll read it just because people in the back can't see it. It said that there are so many pressures crushing administrators today. It's enough for many to question why they made the decision to come out of the classroom in the first place. Now, this image of a crushing nature of the work certainly fits with my sense of what's going on. I, last week, finished a program at the School of Education at Harvard, which brought together about 54 people for a workshop and collected some data from them right at the beginning, asked them a series of questions. And I want to feed back some of the data just to get a sense of how folks are feeling. Now, I should say this is self-report data from a self-selected group, and so I'm just putting it here to be suggestive. But it's worth looking at what they said. Now, I could go into the details, but I don't have the time. But I asked them the question, and it was on a Likert scale from almost always, often, sometimes, seldom, and then never. But if you take those first three categories, almost always, often, and sometimes, 89% felt overwhelmed by all the stuff on their plate. 80% scolded themselves when they performed less than perfectly. 84% said that they neglected to take care of themselves in the midst of stress. And 51% said that they felt like imposters. Okay. Now, why do I present that data? Partly because it's tough out there. I would also suggest that if I were to ask you those questions, I'll bet the data wouldn't be much different for people in the classrooms. It's really tough in those situations, and there's a lot of feeling and a lot of stuff that's going on. Okay, that information came from this workshop that I mentioned. It was on the inner life of leaders. It was called the Institute on Inner Strengths of Successful Leaders. And just a quick word about that. It was focused on people in various leadership positions in schools and in universities. And the guiding belief of the Institute was that in leadership there are tremendous rewards in the job, but there's no leading without bleeding, as we put it in just a couple of words. That a lot of people out there are really feeling wounded, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on inside that they feel like they can't show because leaders are supposed to be strong, they're supposed to display that they really know what's going on. The aim of the Institute was to help leaders handle the stress and strain without losing their cool and clarity. And the focus was really on the application or the use of mindfulness techniques and a heavy focus on the relaxation response as well as self-compassion. I'd be happy to say more about that later outside of this forum if anybody's interested. Okay, wrap it up. What's the advice on becoming an effective advocate? In the moment, when you're meeting with people and you're trying to convince them to what's going on, the argument I'm trying to make is you got to respond with your head, both in terms of remembering spend and trying to make the arguments that'll play into the head of the administrators who are trying to make a decision about what you're asking for. And you also need to make it in in many ways. You know, it's going to be stories, it's going to be research, it's going to be visitations, it's going to be a variety of things, and doing it all without overpromising. And also, in the moment, you need to respond with your heart to administrators. And I think the way to think about it, when you're looking across the table at an administrator who often, again, because they think that they're supposed to be strong, that's what leaders are supposed to be, are going to come across as if they're fully in charge. And sometimes they are fully in charge. But also, if you think about looking across the table, what also you may see some version, what I call, if you will, the Pope. That where does that person really feeling? Perplexed, overwhelmed, preoccupied, and exhausted. That also may sound familiar to a number of teachers. And in that context, I think the more that you can be empathic to people in that situation, and the more that you can listen, the more you enhance your chances of being successful. And in order to be a successful advocate, I think you need to do all this and learn to live in the moment. Thank you.